On September 7, 2023, Gustavo Petro, the first Colombian president to openly call the war on drugs, La Guerra contra las Drogas, a failure, met with Mexican President Andrés López Obrador. Petro and Obrador are attempting to recruit Latin American countries to change direction when it comes to the war on drugs. Petro said, "Somos las mayores víctimas de esta política." We are the biggest victims of this policy. ¿Por qué? Well, let's take this back to the 1800s when products in the U.S. contained cocaine and other drugs as ingredients. Morphine and opium were used for things like asthma medications and infants' teething syrup. Coca-Cola's original recipe was introduced in stores in 1886 and contained cocaine as an ingredient. Laws to ban or regulate drugs in the U.S. began in the 1800s. Morphine and opium were the first substances to be regulated, beginning with the Congressional Taxation of 1890. Next came the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act of 1909, where the importation and smoking of opium became illegal. However, opium was still permitted for medicinal use. This act was criticized for targeting Chinese populations in the U.S. Opium was imported from China, and this law was passed while protests were being held across the country about the economic and political impact of Chinese immigrants. Although a very small minority of Chinese immigrants were involved in the opium business, opium was used as a justification for Chinese exclusion. The Harrison Act of 1914 inhibited the production, importation, and distribution of cocaine and general opiates with taxation. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, beginning the American period known as Prohibition. This amendment prohibited alcohol manufacturing, transportation, and sale. Prohibition remained until the 21st Amendment was ratified in December 1933, which overturned the previous 18th Amendment outlawing alcohol. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. This act taxed the domestic sale of marijuana but did not criminalize the possession or use of the substance. The act was introduced by Representative Robert L. Doughton of North Carolina and drafted by Harry Anslinger. In the 1960s, drug use became a major security issue and the country feared an upcoming drug epidemic. Richard Nixon got elected by exploiting this fear among socially conservative voters and was elected in 1968. In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which regulated certain drugs and substances. The schedules of drugs were created, and marijuana was placed as a Schedule I drug, highly addictive with little to no medicinal value. Other drugs that fall into this category would be LSD, heroin, and MDMA. Finally, in 1971, Nixon declared a war on drugs, and he said America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. Nixon increased federal funding for drug control agencies. Mandatory prison sentencing for drug crimes was enacted. The Special Action Office for Drug Abuse Prevention was then created, and in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was also created. The DEA's goal was to target illegal drug use and smuggling. 1,470 agents were involved, and they had a budget less than $75 million. Today, the numbers have increased to nearly 5,000 agents and a budget of $2.03 billion. John Ehrlichman was the first political aide to speak out and make waves about the new war on drugs. He said in an interview that the Nixon campaign had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people, which led to questions about Nixon's intentions. Ehrlichman said, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black people, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news." Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. In the 1970s, there was a brief pause in the offensive for the drug war. 11 states decriminalized marijuana. Jimmy Carter became president in 1977 after his campaign included decriminalizing marijuana. The Senate Judiciary Committee voted to decriminalize up to 1 ounce. Then in the 1980s election, Ronald Reagan was elected and refocused on drugs. Congress passed severe penalties for drug-related crimes, and a massive increase in incarcerations for non-violent drug crimes ensued. The war on drugs has officially contributed to an unequal prison system. By the mid-1980s, 6 million Americans would be using cocaine regularly. Also in the 1980s, a crack cocaine epidemic swept through the nation. Reagan reinforced and expanded Nixon's anti-drug policies. Reagan said drug use was a repudiation of everything America is. Nancy Reagan launched the Just Say No campaign to spread awareness about the dangers of drug use. Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1986, which added mandatory prison sentences for drug offense, and this act was criticized for being racist. Longer prison sentences were given for crack cocaine cases than powder cocaine cases in the same amounts. Crack cocaine was primarily used by black Americans, while powder cocaine was primarily used by white Americans. 5-year automatic prison sentences were given for 5 grams of crack, while it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to get that same sentence. Bill Clinton was elected after running on a tough-on-crime platform, and in 1994 passed the Crime Bill, a $30 billion bill that funded 125,000 new state prison cells, mandated life sentences via 3 strikes, and added 60 new crimes worthy of the death penalty. The Federal Bureau of Prisons reported that people of color were targeted and arrested on suspicion of drug use at higher rates than white people. 400,000 nonviolent drug offenses were recorded in 1997 versus 50,000 in 1980. In 2014, almost half of the 186,000 people in federal prison had been arrested on drug-related charges. Public support for the war on drugs has decreased since the 1990s as some policymakers and Americans feel the policies are ineffective and contribute to a racial divide. From 2009 to 2013, 40 states softened drug laws. In 2010, Congress passed the FSA Fair Sentencing Act to reduce the discrepancy between crack and powder cocaine from 100 to 1 down to 18 to 1. The war on drugs is still ongoing, yet less prevalent than it had been before.
While the war on drugs began in the U.S., Colombia, the world's largest cocaine producer, has been in the midst of the longest civil war in modern history. Over 50 years of battle began in 1964 between far-left guerrillas group FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, far-right-wing militant groups, and the Colombian government. They were fighting for control of the country, which at the time had a struggling economy. When cocaine became popular in the U.S. in the 1970s, the Colombian drug trade increased exponentially. Though FARC did not initially support being involved, they could not deny how popular and in-demand cocaine had become since the U.S. became a major buyer. Revenue from the trafficking and production of cocaine could be used to fuel their fight against the Colombian state. The fight for control of the country quickly turned to a fight for control of the cocaine industry, as this is what dictated the economy of Colombia. FARC began to tax the coca leaf farmers that were in their area of control. This is because coca leaves are the only raw ingredient in cocaine. Until other ingredients like gasoline, cement, and acetone are added, the coca leaf is not cocaine. Coca does not equal cocaine. Coca is a plant most grown in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. Coca leaves are a strong part of indigenous cultures all across Latin America. Coca has been used in medicinal, spiritual, and recreational ways for hundreds of years. Historically, the coca leaf has been used by the indigenous people as a natural pain remedy, relief for stomach issues, and mild stimulant. The stimulating effect is only when it is put into teas or chewed. Before the declaration of the war on drugs, there was little state control and regulation regarding coca crops in Colombia. Right, now back to the Civil War and how it turned into a major drug syndicate. After recognizing the power and money behind controlling part of the drug trade, FARC found themselves fighting against another power beside the state, the Colombian cartels. Billions of dollars of cocaine revenue flowed into the country, fueling both guerrillas and cartels. The U.S. began supplying Colombian government with advanced weaponry and financial military aid, further fueling an already bloody and drawn-out conflict. When Nixon declared a public war on drugs in the 70s, coca cultivation in Colombia gave the U.S. another reason to become involved in Colombian affairs. One aspect of this involvement included pushing for the extradition of cartel members and increasing financial and military assistance, particularly in the hunt for Pablo Escobar, who waged war against the Colombian state during his campaign to outlaw extradition of cartel members to the United States. This plan to aid Colombia and turn them into an economic and military ally was called Plan Colombia. And despite the country still struggling with the cocaine industry, this plan is considered a huge success by the United States. With the state increasing in power, the two opposing guerrilla and cartel groups decide to join together in their work in the cocaine industry against the state. A new mafia emerges as this powerful group works directly against the state for control of the economy, government, and nation. Keep in mind, there has been past evidence of corruption linked to the state reaping benefits of the drug trade, most notably being Pablo Escobar, who was a Colombian congressman and infamous cartel lord. In one way or another, all groups involved in the Civil War are now involved in the cocaine trade. In 2016, a peace agreement was struck between the Colombian state and FARC. This peace agreement outlines that FARC would cease involvement in the cocaine trafficking industry, and the state would provide coca crop farmers with a legal alternative crop. This agreement was meant to end Colombia's involvement in the global cocaine business, but the president that proposed and passed the peace agreement, Juan Manuel Santos, was not re-elected. The next president was right-leaning leader Iván Duque, who did not support the agreement and was even accused of sabotaging it during his time in office. Duque criminalized coca crops and failed to provide farmers with alternatives. Despite this, cocaine production reached a record high during his presidency. Due to how the peace agreement was conducted and resulted, the public opinion of the government, especially that of farmers, is generally negative. Many feel as though the state does not support them or recognize their issues and therefore have distrust and cynical views of their own government. Currently, 70 to 80% of the world's cocaine is produced in Colombia from locally grown plants or cocaine-based imported from Peru or Bolivia. In 2022, Colombia elected the nation's first ever leftist president, former guerrilla member Gustavo Petro. Soon into his time in office, Petro became the first Colombian leader to publicly speak against the war on drugs, saying it has failed. On September 7, 2023, the presidents of Colombia and Mexico came together at the Latin American Conference on Narcotics to discuss redesigning and rethinking policies regarding the failed war on drugs. Petro said, "Somos las mayores víctimas de esta política." We are the biggest victims of this policy.